The question of multilateralism versus unilateralism lies at the heart of most every pressing international issue today. Should the United States, the so-called hyperpower, with military, political, economic, and technological capabilities unrivaled in history, chart its own course, or join the consensus building of international institutions in dealing with critical issues? The debate often centers on the United Nations itself. Some, such as former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, writing in the current issue of Foreign Policy, has deemed the United Nations indispensable in the 21st century. She argues that the United Nations is anything but irrelevant, as some critics claim, that relations between the United States and the United Nations are strong, that the Bush doctrine of preemption, which is not authorized by the United Nations, is actually consistent with U.S. history and U.S. practice, that UN peacekeeping, by and large, has succeeded, that the UN Security Council should be enlarged, that the United Nations poses no threat to the sovereignty of the United States, as you heard from other panelists earlier today, and that the United States should welcome and find helpful Security Council assistance in dealing with future international problems. On the other side of this issue, we have Dr. Michael Glennon, Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Writing in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs, he argues that one thing the Iraq crisis has made clear is that a grand experiment of the 20th century, the attempt to impose binding international law on the use of force, has failed. As the United States has shown, nations need not consider whether armed intervention abroad is legal, merely whether it's preferable to the alternatives. The structure and rules of the Security Council reflect more the hopes of the founders than the realities of how states work, he argues. And these hopes were no match for American hyperpower. Thus, he concludes there is no reason to believe that the Security Council will soon be resuscitated to tackle nerve center security issues, no matter how the crisis in Iraq evolves. But we should recall that the multilateralism versus unilateralism debate extends well beyond the United Nations. It includes a host of international organizations related to the United Nations to varying degrees, such as the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, just to name a few. All of these institutions were part of a global effort to stabilize the international system. Nations have always had and have taken advantage of their option to act unilaterally. This is not anything new in the history of nation states. Multilateralism, in terms of its current usage, dates back to the 1930s and 1940s and describes the organization of nations that operate on common principles. The organization may be permanent or temporary. At the time that multilateralism was coming into vogue, the United States, which had considerable power both unilaterally and bilaterally, and could have exercised it, especially after World War II, decided to do otherwise. According to Dr. Jaime Miller, Deputy Director of Bard College's Program on Globalization and International Affairs, the United States chose to establish a system that would directly leverage its temporary power advantage to institutionalize its commercial and political advantage. One major result of that thought process was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which eventually led to the World Trade Organization. In the same vein of holding U.S. power in abeyance while building a consensus, the United States led a collective effort in the First Persian Gulf War of 1991. Much of the debate about unilateralism versus multilateralism centers on what politicians say rather than what people think. And I thought it would be useful to look at some of the polling information that shows how Americans think on international issues and on U.S. Participation in international institutions. How do Americans feel about the U.S. role and about the multilateralism versus unilateralism debate specifically? And I looked at a whole body of research that was summarized by the Foreign Policy Association. And the research suggests, from polling results, that there is a high level of concern among Americans about the United States' place in the world, as well as a preference for carrying out policies multilaterally. In a recent survey of U.S. foreign policy, the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, for example, found that 71% of the respondents favored an active U.S. role in world affairs, the highest level, I might add, since the Council had been conducting these surveys back in the 1950s. Moreover, Americans want to see an active role not only in the fight against terrorism and in the maintenance of a powerful U.S. military, but in stopping the spread of nuclear weapons, enlarging economic opportunities for Americans, assuring adequate energy supplies, protecting the environment, fighting drug trafficking, and controlling illegal immigration, a whole list of international concerns and goals. 61% said that the United States should work more closely with other nations to fight terrorism, for example. 75% said that they supported the use of U.S. troops against Iraq. This was before the war started. But only 20% at that time said that the United States should invade alone. And furthermore, 65% said that the United States should attack only with UN approval and allied support. In dealing with other issues, according to this body of research, strong majorities of Americans favor working with and through the United Nations. So what course should the United States follow? It certainly has the power to ignore the United Nations for a time. There is no guarantee, however, that U.S. power will last forever. And as we know, other nations that have been powerful historically are not powerful today. To me, however, there doesn't need to be a choice between multilateralism and unilateralism. It simply makes sense to me to work through the United Nations whenever possible. Indeed, it's the only way to address comprehensively the myriad problems facing the world. At the same time, the United States would not and should not ever give up its right to act alone. But those cases should be the exception rather than the rule. I will now pass the microphone to my colleague, Dr. David Houghton, for his comments.
If you go back to 1989, there was a book published by a political scientist called Richard Rose. And the book was called Postmodern President. And he argued in the book that America now effectively had no option but to go multilateral, to act in concert with its allies. According to Rose, there's been a fundamental sea change in the way that the presidency and foreign policy operates. And he argues that ever since the 1970s, since the Carter administration in particular, the powers of the presidency have been sapped by America's economic decline, or what he sees as America's relative economic decline, and also by interdependence, by increased linkages between states which have supposedly eroded America's sovereignty. America has declined relative to its major trading partners, but at the same time the world's become more interlinked economically, with the result that what happens in the world is as affected by what happens in Berlin or Tokyo as it is by Washington. What happens in Washington, D.C., or at least that's Rose's view. And the result of this, as he puts it, is, quote, "In order to succeed, the President now needs the freely given cooperation of foreign nations. The White House retains the attributes of the modern presidency, but in a changing world, these resources are no longer adequate. A postmodern president cannot secure success simply by influencing Congress and public opinion. The president must also influence leaders of other nations and events in the international system." In other words, a president must now go international, or on the terms of this discussion, go multilateral if he's to succeed, if he wants to achieve his aims and objectives. He's going to have to consult with foreign leaders. And Rose sees that as a permanent change, something which he traces to the 70s and to Jimmy Carter. And you can appreciate readily how this would further weaken the leadership capacities of the presidency, if there were in effect a fourth branch of government, in addition to the three that we formally have, called the international community, that would even fragment the system even more than it already is. So for Rose, we've had this fundamental transformation in foreign policy and in the American presidency itself. And he sees this as something permanent. Now, my own feeling is that this contention, that this was some sort of permanent change in the presidency and foreign policy, is at the very least dramatically overblown, because Rose seems to have confused the travails of the Carter administration and the events of the 1970s for something more durable and something more lasting. In particular, I think he underestimated the role of presidential will, the role of presidential leadership in making things happen. Although Iraq is in many ways an ambiguous case, clearly the US could do with some assistance from its allies. Clearly it could do with some military help in restoring some sort of order to Iraq. The expensive invasion there shows quite clearly that America still has the capacity to do that. It still has the ability, the power to do it. Moreover, the Bush administration's unilateral stance on a lot of other issues shows the same thing. And I think the fallacy of Rose's claim has been amply illustrated by the Bush administration. Indeed, I would argue that unilateralism is not only still possible, but is right now effectively the only means of achieving American foreign policy. Given the nature of Bush's objectives, I think unilateralism is effectively the only choice that America has. Though the Chinese seem to be sitting on the sidelines on many issues, Germany, France and Russia in particular stand in the way of many of Bush's objectives. And therefore the choice becomes one of going multilateral and doing nothing, or going it alone. Unilateralism is logically the only route. It's the only thing you're left with. And though it never said so in so many words, and I have no evidence that Bill Clinton ever read Richard Rose's Postmodern Presidency book, the Clinton administration seemed to think of multilateralism as a necessity of some sort, something that you simply had to do because America had declined and no longer had the capacity to lead on its own. But that multilateralism, as we all know, led the Clinton administration into all sorts of difficulties, particularly on Bosnia, where for year after year the attempt to create some sort of international coalition to stop the war in Yugoslavia really led to embarrassment on Clinton's part. It led to embarrassment on the part of the United States. Because it became clear that America's allies did not see the war in Bosnia the same way that America did. They didn't see Milosevic in the same sort of moralistic evil as a moralistic evil. They weren't prepared to adopt the same sort of means that Clinton was. Lift and strike degenerated into rift and drift. And that multilateral course of action really did not succeed until America simply said, enough, that's it, we're going to launch airstrikes in 1995. And effectively it was a kind of unilateral, multilateral solution. Unilateralism, I think, has evolved in part out of a conservative feeling that, as Charles Krauthammer has put it, we're now living in a unipolar world and America should start acting in a way commensurate with its power. But it's not just the result of a bit of macho chest beating, I think. This transition to a unilateralist strategy is also in part a result of a rational learning process. It's a reaction to the 1990s, I think, when America attempted, particularly in Bosnia, to pursue a multilateral course and for many years failed. One of the great ironies of recent US foreign policy, of course, is that it was the first Bush administration which popularized the idea of going multilateral. The success of that strategy in the first Persian Gulf War, I think, misled leaders who came after, particularly Clinton, into thinking that these kind of international coalitions could be constructed on practically any issue which came along. I think the lesson of the first Gulf War was in a sense learned too well, and it became a false or misleading analogy later on for Clinton. When America's allies perceived and identified an enemy in the same way that America did, and agreed on the means, then multilateralism worked well, and that was the case in the first Gulf War. When they disagreed on the means, and to some extent the extent of the threat coming from the enemy, multilateralism did not work. And in a sense, to go multilateral in the early 1990s, rather than adopt a unilateral stance, I think, was in a sense immoral. It was given that it allowed the slaughter to continue year after year before anything was done. That is one of the downsides of multilateralism, I think. And of course, it was the disaster in Somalia as well, which put a lot of politicians off the whole idea of multilateralism. It needed strong and decisive US leadership to break the impasse. And I think the Kosovo action, where the US bypassed the UN, was in a sense another case of unilateral multilateralism. They went through NATO, the US went through NATO, but in a way which there was a sense in which NATO was simply responding to American national interests and American leadership. My reason for saying that Iraq's an ambiguous case earlier on is that it shows that a unilateralist course has considerable costs. I certainly wouldn't deny that the financial and the political costs are quite considerable. And we can see both of these now. The Bush administration's asked for an additional $20 billion as part of an $87 billion addendum to the budget. The political costs have also been very considerable because Bush has in many ways alienated America's allies. Even in Britain, where Prime Minister Blair has taken considerable political heat for making that decision to back the United States. Even in Britain, I don't think there's real support for the line of action which George Bush took in Iraq. Another danger is, of course, that you might fly in the face of the international community, and in so doing may find yourself on the wrong side of the issue. You may find that weapons of mass destruction didn't in fact exist, for instance, and then that worsens relations even more because the European powers are, of course, saying, aha, I told you so. We told you there were no weapons and you haven't found any. That also worsens relations with other powers, and it diminishes American standing. These are all costs that Bush is prepared to pay, but there's always the risk that an international backlash turns into a national one. And now we see we see Bush's popularity declining, we see Congress to some extent turning against Bush on this issue. On the other hand, inaction in the face of opposition from Europe and everywhere and elsewhere cost Clinton political capital, domestically and internationally. Pursuing a multilateral route has considerable costs as well. And again, I've got the case of Bosnia in mind. Clinton lost a huge amount of credibility in Europe by attempting to go this multilateral route, even though it allowed this slaughter to continue. Again, though, I see little alternative in the Iraq case to going it alone. If the administration can get Iraq out of the way somehow and move attention more towards the war on terrorism, as the Europeans see it, because the Europeans don't see a particularly strong link between the issue of weapons proliferation and the issue of terrorism. Those are separate in the mind of most European states. whereas they became merged in the Bush administration's policies. If they can return to the hunt for Al-Qaeda or to more obvious terrorist targets, then there's a greater opportunity to pursue a genuine multilateral route, I think. But right now, given what Bush wants to do, it's enormously difficult to take any other option but the unilateral one. My real reservation about Bush's strategy is not that he's been unilateralist, it's that he has been rather politically ham-handed in the way that he's dealt with the European allies. The classic example was the US walkout after Bush had made his speech at the UN a week or two ago. Maybe if he'd stayed and listened to what the other leaders had to say, maybe if he'd bit his tongue and just listened to Chirac, that would have been considerably better politically than simply walking out as a delegation and making it clear that you don't care what the Europeans think. I think if you're going to use unilateralism, you have to use it with a light touch. You have to be more politically skillful than that. There are ways of practicing give and take and negotiation and compromise which allow you to preserve essentially a unilateralist strategy while still giving the appearance of listening and receptivity. And Bush clearly doesn't want to give that appearance. So I think he needs to adopt a lighter touch on that. Okay, I've probably gone on too long with that, so.
You left me 20 minutes.
Thanks.
I'd like to give you some views of a field man, which is what I like to refer to myself here today as. I'm not an academic. I've spent most of my life outside the United States, and I've had to confront, deal, look at issues that many of us are only now beginning to look at, and I think because of my perspective, we've overreacted to an issue that others have been living with for many years. It's like not having any shoes and seeing someone who has shoes, you think they have everything and you have nothing, but until you actually see that they don't have shoes, you don't really care about it. You don't deal with it. The subject is international criminal law, multilateralism, and unilateralism. I think the other two gentlemen have addressed that quite well, so I'm going to go at it from a couple of viewpoints and then try and sum it up. First, some observations about multilateralism and unilateralism as it pertains to international law. I'll be very brief on this. The world today is more interdependent than at any time in history, and the body of international legislation supporting criminal law is extensive and firmly established. A new area, however, relates to the recently created criminal court, which is authorized by the 2002 Rome Statute. This is an interesting new piece of legislation because the world has been trying to introduce it for over 50 years and has finally succeeded. In 2002, however, the United States, who has been a very strong advocate of this legislation, began sending mixed signals regarding the support. The world is also concerned about our participation in the International Criminal Court because we want it to apply to all of the world's nations, but not to the United States. Following is a quote from a recent statement by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Quote, as envisioned in the 1998 treaty signed by over 100 nations, the International Criminal Court is designed to bring to justice individuals who commit genocide and crimes against humanity. The court is emblematic of emerging international legal trends that have significant implications for the United States' ability to shape the future international law and institutions. It also highlights the tensions between a foreign policy based on strengthening collective norms and responses, or the alternative one based primarily on unilateral actions and the use of force, unquote. An international concern about the United States today is that we have pushed for this legislation since World War II, and now we apparently are not interested in participating. Over 100 countries have ratified the Rome Treaty since 1998, while only 3 have refused. the United States because of our concerns about the court's independent right to call for a trial, Israel because of wording about criminal proceedings against states moving populations into occupied territories, and China over the court's ability to try people from states who have not ratified the agreement. Following additional accommodations made to the United States by the organizations which we're negotiating with to join this organization, President Clinton signed the Rome Agreement during his second term. So we were members of this organization, and many Europeans thought, and many others in the world thought, we finally have something that's going to be viable. However, the newly elected Bush administration, I believe it was in May 2002, revoked the earlier approval. Another concern today is that the United States has abrogated to herself the right to preemptively strike any person or state that it believes might be preparing to strike it. In the Cold War era, such a policy may have had merit, but even in those perilous times, the United States government refused to endorse a preemptive strike policy involving nuclear weapons. In the post-Cold War era, such a policy has far-reaching ramifications for multilateralism. The United States' post-9/11 decision to hold foreign and certain domestic persons, and even American citizens, incommunicado, as enemy combatants, and to hold them for indeterminate periods of time and without rights afforded to all under our Bill of Rights, also concerns many of those who support the rule of law. Since the waning days of World War II, the United States has encouraged multilateralism in world affairs. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and a host of other worthwhile international organizations are examples of this. Since the Second World War, the United States has also sought to marginalize states pursuing unilateral policies which threaten the existing world order. In the last few years, this policy has weakened, and the United States now considers unilateral solutions to serious international problems as a viable way to accomplish our national objectives. This policy has already been pointed out to you by several of the speakers this morning, and I think a few moments ago, points out that it will open a lot of issues that we will not be able to control and may bring incredible harm to the world. Before 9/11, the world beyond America's borders existed with terrorism as a fact of life. For us here in the United States, however, the word was virtually meaningless. Terrorism was always something that happened to others. We saw it on television or read about it in our media. It always affected those far away who were socially, politically, and economically unimportant to our lives and more important to our security. I was educated in an area of the world where terrorism was and still is a fact of life. Bombs went off in trolley cars when I was in Beirut in the 1950s. I was in Iran when our diplomats were assassinated by terrorists. I lived in Greece when 5 Americans were assassinated on the street of Athens by November the 17th, a Greek resistance group who objected to the CIA's support of an oppressive Greek military junta which our country had installed. I was in Cyprus at a time when car bombs were frequently heard in Nicosia. I also personally knew 5 of these people who were killed, assassinated. Those responsible for all of this terrorism were usually seeking to focus attention against those who they perceived to be responsible for their problems. Behind the events of 9/11, in my opinion, is not militant Islam's differences with Christianity, but non-secular issues in which the United States has been involved in for years. These have so offended some in the world for so long that they see no alternative but to bring the grievance to our shores. Is their behavior excusable? Absolutely not. Is it legal? Again, absolutely not. Is there something we should do about it? Absolutely, we should stop it. But the solution to the problem is really multidimensional. It's one that requires soul-searching on our part and hard decisions that we have to make about where we are and who we are in the world. Because of our overwhelming military power, we have, until now, also been able to seek quick military solutions to complex international problems, which basically assuage our need for revenge. But unless we address the core issues I have mentioned earlier, these palliatives will do little to resolve our long-term terrorism problem. The world is a fluid and changing place in which yesterday's status quo may not be the case tomorrow. The British ruled North America in the 17th century. When our forefathers disagreed with the British, they labeled them revolutionaries and in many instances terrorists. We must remember that there are those in our world today who now look to us to help them emulate what we have created for ourselves. When we ignore or betray them, some hold us accountable, and we must try to rectify that wrong before violence results. For America to declare war on terrorism without clearly quantifying its basis, our end game, and what constitutes victory, our war is one bound to fail. The framers of our Constitution knew that when they wrote our Constitution. From 1956 until 1966, I lived in Iraq as a young man of 15 to 25 years of age. The beginning of that period was one in which Iraq's rule of law closely resembled our own. Gradually, however, Iraqis lost their rights because their government was uninterested in the rule of law, and we all know how their saga ended. Simply put, unilateralism and multilateralism means going it alone or going with others, following international laws and conventions or not following them, or being part of a system or being outside of that system. What has been America's role in multilateralism in the last 100 years? In 1915, as European world powers were destroying one another in the First World War, Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, became concerned. A Virginia academic raised during the troubled years of Southern Reconstruction, Wilson saw unilateralism as undesirable. Consequently, he sought a comprehensive new post-war international order that would end many of the issues which had also confronted him in the world of his youth. On January the 8th, 1918, he created the League of Nations. Wilson's League worked for the next 2 decades and eventually failed when powerful nations no longer endorsed multilateralism as a way of resolving their international problems and disagreements. The conflict, which began in the 1930s and ended 7 years later at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, reinforced the United States' belief in multilateralism in the post-war era. Franklin Roosevelt's State of the Union address in 1941 pointed out that we needed a post-war system that would provide international protections for freedom of speech, religion, and economic cooperation. 4 years later, on April the 12th, 1945, as President Harry Truman was being sworn in as the 33rd president following the sudden death of Franklin Roosevelt, Truman was asked if the United States would attend the first San Francisco United Nations organizational meeting. Truman said yes, and 55 years and 140 days later, we are gathered here at UCF to discuss whether the United Nations may go the way of the former League of Nations. Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, our government has served de facto and de jure notice that we no longer need the United Nations to pursue our objectives in the international world, and that if the United Nations stands in our way, we'll go around it. A similar set of circumstances brought about the end of the League of Nations. In conclusion, I have wandered a little bit from the main point of our discussion, but I believe these issues are germane to our concerns here today. If the United States is to continue leading the world in a positive manner, we must set the example. If we believe existing international forums are irrelevant, then like Mr. Harding in 1918 and like Mr. Roosevelt in 1941 and 1945, we need to lead the way in creating new international institutions or a forum that better addresses ours and the world's needs. Alternatively, we must strengthen the existing international institutions and make them more relevant if there is no other way. The existing order is one that has brought us peace and prosperity for the last 50 years. It is worth saving. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller and Dr. Houghton, for your insightful comments. We'll now take some questions from the audience.
My first question is directed toward Mr. Miller. You brought up the point of the ICC, that America doesn't support the ICC. From what I've read, is it a legitimate concern that some of our own political members or government official or military officials might be indicted under that court as war criminals? For example, Henry Kissinger is a sought-after political figure in some countries, not just for speaking engagements, as if you've read the reports of Christopher Hitchens regarding that. Can you answer the first question?
The United States is a world, I'll just call it a world power, hyperpower and superpower. We do have legitimate concerns. I served in the military myself, and because we frequently participate in, or at least in the past until Iraq, participated in United Nations endeavors in which we usually led the effort. There is a valid concern about our soldiers and people being accused of crimes against humanity, crimes against genocide and these type of things. Therefore, we are somewhat reticent to join until all of these little dots and T's have been crossed. But the real issue, in my opinion, is not those, because those can be worked out as the process starts. The concern is that it will be politicized, number one, and people will use it against us to make us into a world power that advocates genocide, crimes against humanity, and that our people are no good. I think eventually we're going to rejoin. All of these concerns are being addressed one by one, but there is some, in the process, there is some irritation in the world community that we're demanding all of these special privileges where other people won't get them. We'll have to wait and see how that all works itself out.
Thank you for answering that question. The second question is directed towards all the members of the panel. I find the UN is having difficulty, even some states internationally are having difficulty defining what terrorism is, what a terrorist is. For example, how do you distinguish between a terrorist and a freedom fighter? What is your interpretation of what a terrorist is? Do you see in the future in UN or a state a cohesive definition of what a terrorist is or what is considered terrorism in any part of the world?
Is it me again? From my experience in the international world, absolutely. I addressed that issue in my comments earlier, that unless we define what these things are, we'll never win. And that applies also for a definition of terrorism, because our president's declaration is so widespread that today we're building a supranational intelligence organization, which we do need to address this issue. But it's beginning to remind me of other places I've been in my life where similar organizations ended up bringing down the freedoms that the people had, because it's too comprehensive. We do need to define what is terrorism, absolutely. And I don't know who's going to do that, because there is no debate going on that right now that's really serious, in my opinion.
Do you have your own opinions about what a terrorist is?
Well, I would only respond to it this way. George Washington was wanted by the British Crown for terrorism against the state. He and his brethren around him were seeking independence. I find it difficult to say that in his case I would support it. In the case of the people of Dili and Indonesia, that I would not support theirs or somebody else's. But this is an issue that has to be addressed by a world body, maybe the International Court, someone like that, who will define these issues, and then we all have to agree and comply with them.
My definition of terrorism is essentially armed combatants that we don't happen to like. It's a very flexible term, and I agree entirely with Robert that the Bush administration failed to define what terrorism is. And it's all very well having a pack of cards telling us in Iraq who the specific threats are. What we need is a list of who the terrorists are. You need to make it very clear, and I think for political reasons they haven't done this. It needs to be made a lot clearer than it's been made already, exactly who the terrorists are and what Bush means by the term terrorism. Is, for instance, state terrorism included? Many of the Middle East would see Israel as a terrorist state. Now, obviously, the United States doesn't want to even get into that for political reasons, but who are the terrorists? When is it permissible to use force against, to use terror against citizens of another country? The Contra rebels were terrorists, presumably, or maybe they weren't. We need a definition of what distinguishes a freedom fighter or a rebel or somebody fighting for liberation from a terrorist. I think a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder. But I'd like to hear, I've wanted for a long time to hear Bush define what he means by terrorism, and we haven't yet heard that definition. But the risk becomes of one, again, your allies think it's hypocrisy if you simply fight certain types of terrorism, not other types.
Just to add my 2 cents worth, this is a very difficult process that happens to elude the best efforts, not just of government officials, but academics and others. I teach a course called Coercion in International Politics, which focuses primarily on terrorism. And the book we use in that course, Inside Terrorism, by Bruce Hoffman, which is the primary text, spends the first 40 or so pages trying to define terrorism. And unfortunately, as both gentlemen have suggested, who is a terrorist is basically in the eye of the beholder. If you are the aggrieved party, you're going to look upon the perpetrator as a terrorist. If you are the person carrying out the action, you're more likely to see yourself as a freedom fighter. And so the definitions run the entire spectrum. My simple working definition for terrorism is an activity that involves at least 3 elements. One is a perpetrator that carries out an act of destruction or violence against people. The second is a victim. And third, the intended target. And the victim and the intended target are not necessarily the same thing. But again, it all depends on your perspective, and this freedom fighter versus terrorist debate has been going on, I might add, not just for the past 2 years or the past several decades, but for literally hundreds of years. Terrorism, as I like to say, is one of the oldest professions, along with espionage and a few others that I won't name. So I invite you to join the debate, because it is not as simple as it might appear, and we definitely need better definitions at the United Nations, in the U.S. government, and elsewhere.